The UFC's heavyweight division is a complete mess.
I feel like I should apologize to the fans.
Recently, Tom Aspinall became the undisputed champion of the heavyweight division.
Jon Jones is officially retired. Tom Aspinall is the heavyweight champion of the UFC.
But outside of Tom, there's not really any contenders that could legitimately beat him.
As I've always said, I'll fight anyone, I'll fight anytime, and I'll fight anywhere. Never turn down a fight in my life, never will.
And when you look throughout the rankings of the heavyweight division, there's really not a lot there. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. Also, if you're enjoying the videos and want to support the channel, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, videos, alongside with other perks as well. But anyways, let's get into it. When you talk throughout time, whether you're talking about in MMA or even in boxing, typically the most exciting division is the heavyweight division. And the reason that is because obviously those guys are the biggest guys in the UFC or in boxing. So they hit extremely hard, a fight can change on any given shot, and it's just the most unpredictable division in the entire UFC or in the entirety of boxing. But when you look at the current heavyweight division in the UFC, there's really not all that much there. Of course, Tom Aspinall is a champion and he's a great fighter and a great champion, but outside of him, there's really not too many great fighters or even good fighters at the heavyweight division. Usually when you talk about a division, you have 2 or 3 guys that are legitimate championship contenders. And outside of that, you also have at least a couple of prospects that are on the come up, whether they're unranked or whether they're low in the rankings currently, but guys that you could potentially see competing for the belt in the distant future. But when you currently look at the heavyweight division, it's really just Tom Aspinall. Outside of him, I would consider there only to be around 3 or 4 fighters that I would even consider to be decent, and those guys would include Cyril, Gane, Alexander Volkov, Curtis Blades, and Jailton Almeida. And even for those guys that I just mentioned, I don't see any one of those fighters legitimately competing or legitimately giving Tom Aspinall a difficult fight. And outside of those guys that I just mentioned, the rest of the heavyweight division are just full of a bunch of blobs and full of a bunch of guys that I don't consider to be really good fighters whatsoever. So I think the current state of the heavyweight division is in a really bad place, and in my opinion, this current heavyweight division is probably one of the worst that we've seen in a very long time. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why does it matter? Why does it matter if the heavyweight division isn't all that talented? When you look around the UFC, there's a lot of talent in other weight classes. 155, 125, 145, 170, 185. There's a lot of weight classes at this point that have a lot of talent, good champions and legitimate contenders, and even some pretty good prospects coming up as well. Well, in my opinion, the reason why the heavyweight division is so important is due to the pay-per-view sales. As I touched upon before, in boxing and even in the UFC in the early days, the fights that sold the most pay-per-views were the fights that had heavyweight title fights at the top of the ticket. And the reason why that was is you're having 2 of the best fighters in the world, 2 of the biggest guys in the entire UFC or the entirety of boxing, going up against each other and seeing who's better. One guy could be winning the majority of the fight, 2.5 rounds, 4.5 rounds, then all of a sudden they take a huge counter shot and get knocked out. I think that's really the allure of the heavyweight division. And when you talk about some of the biggest names in the UFC in the past, or some of the biggest names in boxing in the past, a lot of them are in the heavyweight division. But unfortunately, when you look at the current UFC's heavyweight division, as I touched upon before, it's really just Tom Aspinall. A Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall or a Francis Ngannou versus Tom Aspinall has a lot more excitement to it and will sell a lot more pay-per-views because it's a legitimate fight that Jon Jones or Francis Ngannou could win. But when you look at some of the current contenders, I don't really think they have much of a chance to beat Tom. If you look at Cyril, Gane, I think Tom can just take him down and submit him. If you look at Volkov, I think Tom can just take him down and submit him. If you look at Curtis Blades, Tom can keep the fight on the feet and knock him out. Jailton Almeida, the same could be said there. I just think Tom Aspinall has a significant and a very obvious advantage over all of these quote-unquote contenders. And when you're matching Tom Aspinall against a guy who seems to be an easy matchup for him, it's not going to sell nearly as many pay-per-views as opposed to a matchup where Tom could actually lose. But another question that some of you may may be wondering at this point is, do I think the heavyweight division will ever get better? And in my opinion, the answer is yes. When you talk about the 125-pound division back in the day when Demetrius Johnson was obviously the best and he had a million title defenses, it seemed like that weight class would never get better. But when you look at the current flyweight division, I think it's one of the best weight classes. At the top, you have Alexandre Pantoja, who's an amazing champion. You have a lot of contenders. You even have a lot of up-and-coming prospects, and the division is just very deep from top to bottom. And I think we could potentially see a similar thing in the heavyweight division in the future. Similar to Demetrius, I think Tom Aspinall is going to get a lot of title defenses. Don't be surprised, even though it is the heavyweight division, don't be surprised if when his career is all said and done, he's able to get 3, 4, 5, or maybe even 6+ title defenses at that weight class. I just think Tom is head and shoulders above everybody else. Now, eventually he is going to lose. Eventually somebody's going to come around and beat him. But I think the fact that there's such a good and well-rounded champion at the top of the weight class is going to force a lot of these potential contenders that are currently contenders or guys who are currently lower in the rankings to make improvements to their game and become a little bit more well-rounded. Because fighters talk about this all the time, but they usually make improvements to their game or make adjustments based on who's the current champion. And due to the fact that Tom's able to do so many different things, in my opinion, will make a lot of these contenders better. But overall, even outside of some of the contenders they currently have in the UFC at this point, if Tom's able to actually get 3, 4, 5, 6+ title defenses before his career is all said and done, there'll eventually be one or maybe even multiple more guys that get signed to the UFC from a different organization, or maybe some young up-and-comers that get signed to the UFC via the Dana White Contender Series that will eventually turn themselves into legitimate contenders and beat Tom Aspinall. So I think the fact that there is such a talented fighter at the top of the weight class does breed hope for the rest of the weight class going forward. Now, maybe it will take some time. Maybe the heavyweight division won't get better for another 3 years. Maybe it won't get better for another 5 years. But eventually the UFC's heavyweight division will be at a much better spot than it is at currently. There's been a bunch of examples in the past of other weight classes not being all that good whatsoever, like the 125-pound weight class that I had mentioned before, but eventually weight classes do a really good job at making improvements, whether that's the current guys on the roster making improvements to their game, whether that's the UFC going out and signing fighters from different organizations, whether that's the UFC looking for prospects and signing them on the Contender Series. There's a lot of different ways for a particular weight class to get better, but I think overall the fighters alongside with the UFC do a really good job at making improvements over time. And although the heavyweight division isn't all that great at this point, I think eventually it's going to be at a much better place. But I guess we'll see what the UFC decides to do going forward. Obviously, I've made a video in the past talking about how I thought it would be a great idea for the UFC to bring back Francis Ngannou. It would bring a lot of money to the UFC as you would get a huge heavyweight title fight between Tom and Francis. It would bring a lot more excitement to the UFC's heavyweight division, and I just think it would be a win-win for everybody involved. But of course, Dana White isn't a huge fan of Francis Ngannou, to say the least at this point, and I just don't have too much confidence that this fight would happen. Of course, John Jones is another potential guy the UFC can match up between him and Tom at the White House, but of course there's a lot of variables that go alongside John. It became pretty clear that John didn't want to fight Tom Aspinall, so we'll see what happens on that front as well. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think there's any legitimate contenders at this point that could compete or even beat Tom Aspinall, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy it, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.